So before we get into any of the printed parts, which are probably the more interesting part of this video, I just wanted to have a quick run over of what I've been doing in Blender, because I've been spending most of my time in here, and as I said, most of the video is the printing at the moment, and I just thought that I'd show you a bit of the process of the sculpting as well, since it is sculpting and printing rather than just printing video. So what we've got here is the doll version of Sally. She looks a bit plain at the moment, but that's because she doesn't have any textures or colours or anything like that. I've been following a video from Moonlight Jewel that I talked about in the last video, where she makes a doll of Rani from Elden Ring. And I've been looking at how she constructs her joints, how she constructs the person overall, like how she splits it up into different pieces and where they join and things like that. I've had to take a few liberties because she doesn't show absolutely everything on camera, so I've had to sort of guess in a couple of places how things go together. I've also tweaked a couple of things to work for my own ends as well. The proportions of the body, for example, her Rani doll is a lot more cartoonish than Sally is. A much bigger head, much thinner arms and legs, much longer proportionally to her torso as well. So what works with her model wouldn't necessarily work with mine, so I've had to do a couple of bits of work to sort of get that going. But I'll just sort of zoom around a bit and sort of go into a couple of the pieces that I think are a bit more interesting. So her face, for one, is split into two. The reason for having two parts to her face is so that she can have a kind of expressive face. She can have a moving mouth and different expressions with her eyebrows and her eyes, so that her face gives the impression of movement over an animation. And then the second reason is that so the body is going to be held together with elastic, which will be running through the inside of her torso and down through her legs and her arms. And one loop of that gets tied up inside her head. So if we hide the front of her face for the time being, you can see that hole there is where the elastic comes up, and then it'll be tied up in here. And then I can put the faceplate on without having to sort of tie it up inside a piece of plastic with tweezers and things like that. I'm not a surgeon, I can't do that. Then these two pieces here are places to hold magnets, and there are two on the front of the face as well, as you can see. And these just hold the faceplate onto that. So most of her joints are made up by this double ball joint, where there are two axes of rotation, one in this ball here and one in the lower ball. And this was interesting to me when I first came across it, because to me, things like, particularly the elbow, maybe not quite so much the hip, but the elbow definitely bends in one direction. It's more of a kind of lever than it is a ball and socket joint. But I can see the use of doing it this way, because it gives you much more freedom in how you move the arm. It also allows it to twist, so it allows the radius and the ulna to twist around that joint. Whereas if I had made a lever joint here, I wouldn't be able to do that with that. I'd have to twist it at the wrist, which wouldn't necessarily look quite as accurate. It also allows some spacing, so you can see that her thigh here is a lot smaller than you would think it would be. But that's because her hip joint is up here, and essentially this entire thing down to her knee is her thigh. It's just that in order for a hard piece of plastic to come up to a right angle with her spine, you need a lot of space there, otherwise it's just going to collide with that and not bend very far. So you can see here, there isn't a lot of space because your legs don't bend backwards that way, whereas there's a lot of space here because it needs to move all of that 90 degrees up there. And similarly, you can see it with her knee. Your leg doesn't bend this way, it bends this way. So there needs to be more space in the back of the knee than in the front of the knee. Also, her torso is in three parts in order to give the twisting motion of a spine. So if you're sitting down right now and you sort of twist as far as you go, you can feel your shoulders can go further than your hips, and these three parts allow for that sort of motion. Her feet and her hands are attached to ankle and wrist joints respectively with another magnetized system, and this is because when dressing a doll like this, it's a lot easier to get on a piece of clothing if you don't have these things in the way. So you can imagine putting on a pair of trousers is a lot easier if you don't have a solid foot there to get in the way. And I think that's all that I need to show you for now. I'll go into things a bit more when it comes to showing you the printed parts, but for now let's get on with the head tests. The first thing I've done is to test how the printer prints the parts. Layer height, fine detail, time it takes, the surface finish, etc. I've also printed 3 different scales, 1 to 10, the smallest, 1 to 8, and 1 to 5, to see which would work best in my limited space. I've gone ahead and cleaned these up, which is what you're seeing right now, mostly just slicing off all the stringy bits and removing the supports, as well as some sanding. The 2 on the right here were experiments to try to reduce the amount of stringing on the parts by changing the temperature of the printing nozzle and a few other settings. You saw in the beginning how much of a hairy mess those other 3 were. I wanted to minimise that because it's a massive pain to get it all off. For reference, it took about half an hour to clean up just 3 heads. This one was printed at 205 degrees, whereas this one was printed at 195 degrees. The first 3 were 215 degrees. There's still a little bit of stringing, but I think it's an acceptable amount and I don't want to waste too much time fine-tuning the print settings for diminishing returns. I think I'll probably be moving forward with the 1 to 8 scale, which is this size here, because it's not so big that it's unwieldy, like I think the 1 to 5 would be, but not so small that the cleanup becomes difficult and the finer details don't print well. There are still a couple of problems, notably the ears, which are very thin and so end up quite low res when being put through the slicer program, and the chins, which is a result of the orientation that the heads were printed at. The chins can be fixed with some sanding. See, this one I did sand is a lot cleaner than the unsanded one, but the ears will need thickening up in the computer model, and I'll probably need to simplify them too, like getting rid of the cartilage detailing. So I've done a paint test using Liquitex acrylics. On the left we've got a set that's been painted on with a brush, and on the right we've got an airbrushed set, and both have a sanded and unsanded version to see how the texture comes through. The paints were actually quite a lot thinner than I thought they would be. I thought that the thickness of the paint would cover up the surface texture a bit, at least so much that the layers in the unsanded version were no longer visible, but that wasn't the case. In fact, the textures on both sanded and unsanded heads came through really clearly. This is the painted set with the unsanded version here. You can see the layers are still coming through. And we have the sanded version here. You can see some of the layers still there, but it's mostly smoothed out. The problem is that the sanding itself leaves some strange textures on there. Just to the left of her eye here, if I zoom in, it's a lot more bitty than the unsanded one, almost like a stone texture. If I compare it, ignoring the bigger bumps for the time being, it's got a lot less of that pockmarked texture. We do have some holes in the prints, which are quite annoying, and they're in both too, and I can't really do anything about these, apart from using polyfiller or something similar. Though I think that the sanding in general gives a better quality, I'm going to have to be more careful about how aggressive I am with that, and around her eye too, it's still quite messy where I haven't done enough. So maybe using finer grip sandpaper and some tools to get into tighter places like under her chin and under her nose. In contrast, we've got the airbrushed heads. This is the sanded version. And you can see we're still getting the pitting texture through. And we've got a strange texture on the back of her head. Maybe it's the dust I haven't cleaned off properly. But in general, the paint job is a lot less patchy compared to the brushed on set. If we compare them, we can see dark spots and light spots, whereas this one is a lot more even. Also, it took much fewer coats to get a similar level of colour in the airbrushed version. It will need more coats, of course, in the final version, because this is still patchy, but I think for now this is a good indication of what it will be like. Then this is the unsanded version, which is oddly enough smoother, but you can still see the layers. Even though I think the lines really ruin the believability of the face, particularly in close-up shots like this, where they're really visible. And even though the sanded one had a particularly weird texture, I think it is much less strange looking than the lines. However, the paint seems to have gone on far less patchy than the sanded one, which is interesting. They both had the same number of coats and I did them at the same time, but this one just has more colour in it. I think I prefer airbrushing to the paintbrush, because it's generally quicker and it's much more even, but I'll have to be careful in the future to get into places like under her chin and nose, and also behind her ears, without overpainting the surrounding area. So here are all the parts for Sally. She's in a bit of a weird exploded layout at the moment because I couldn't quite fit her on screen otherwise. There are a couple of things I want to talk about as I'm putting her together. I've already put in magnets to the pieces that are going to be magnetised, so her faceplates, her hands and feet, because fiddling around with tiny magnets and superglue for half an hour would not be a fun thing to watch. These are how small the magnets are. They're very tiny, they're 2mm by 2mm. Some bits are sanded, like this one, because it's a joint and I want it to be very easy to move. Obviously, if it's a bit ragged, it would impede movement too much. Other bits, like this one, I've left unsanded because this is a prototype and I'm not going to be painting it. There are some more aggressive sanding marks, like on her torso pieces. These are where they were sitting on the bed and are artifacts from where the supports were holding it up. If my hand is the printing bed, like this, you can see it coming off at the sides, which is pretty hard to print smoothly if you imagine how each new layer is falling off the last. I haven't been able to get the supports to do a better job of coming off than this. They were pretty well bonded. I'll have to come back to this in the next version to see if I can make that better. Though it doesn't really matter too much, since a lot of this is going to be covered by her clothes, like this hole in her sternum. But the big problem areas are her face and her hands. The face is okay, but there wasn't really an easy way to print her hands because it's such a small and intricate piece. You can see the back is all messed up, so I'll definitely need to do more testing for those. With her faceplate, putting it on is quite satisfying, but you can see there's a really obvious join here, which will be a problem when it comes to editing, though I think I could do some camera trickery to hide it from view for most shots. It's a good amount of tackiness though, enough to hold it on, but not strong enough to move the figure when I'm swapping her face out for a different expression or mouth movement. So the whole thing is going to be held together with elastic. Her arms will be held together through her torso, through this little hole here, and at either end her wrists, and actually her ankles too, will have a hook that attaches to that little part, just there, that holds either end of the elastic loop. And then the hand magnetises on afterwards because it's a lot easier to dress her without hands or feet. Then there's an axis going this way as well, which is also a loop. It's tied up here inside her head. Then it comes down through the torso and splits into two at her hips. It comes down like this, then rather than following one leg or the other, it folds like this, and each new loop goes down to each leg and eventually hooks on to her ankles, as I talked about earlier. Okay, so this is the first attempt at tying that knot in there. The knot went in okay, but you can still see her arms are kind of a little bit, that motion's not great. Also that, like, I don't really want that to happen. I might end up, oh yeah, you can see that they just want to contract. That's a little bit too tight. On this side anyway, this one seems a bit better. Yeah, so this has got another one, a location where eventually that just snaps like that, which is not great. So this elastic needs to be less taut. So I need to loosen this a little bit. So, back from a horrendous time off camera, I tied this knot about 6 or 7 different times. As you can see, I made marks on here every time. I made one to see if it was slack or loose and then moved it accordingly. Slack or loose, slack or taut. And you can see how close those marks are together. So really there is a lot of fine tuning that you can do in here. The closest I managed to get, she's still contracting. Any further out, like the next mark along, and she was like really loose, like she didn't hold her shape. And even now, like you can see, it just doesn't quite work. Like, let's put her upright so the gravity works properly. Like if I wanted her arm out like that, it's just going to fall down and do this. So at the same time it's too taut because this is happening, but it's also too loose because this is not keeping its position up in the air, which is just, I don't quite know what to do about that. I think I'm going to rework the joints anyway, because this is not really working for me. This action is quite nice, but it's way too sort of variable. You can do some really crazy things with it. So she can like hold her position in some cases, but like just not in others, which is a difficult problem to have because it means that I can't really fine tune this because it's just going to make if I make it tighter, it's going to make contractions worse. But this will work. This will stiffen up. If I make it looser, then her shoulder will fall out. So I don't really know what to do. But for the time being, I'm going to leave that there, come back after lunch, and do the vertical axis. And hopefully that works a tiny bit better than her arms. My cat is scratching things. I can't do that. Oh my god. Alright, so, a hand fell off. Okay, yeah, okay. Support yourself a bit. So, let's see if I can zoom out a bit. Yeah, so as I was saying, before I forgot the middle part of her torso, it's there. It's just, it doesn't, I guess that's how she would sit, isn't it? Not like that. She's not going to stand up, which I wasn't really expecting her to. No, there's no way she's going to support herself then. Just going to have to sit her down. Like with the claymation stuff, I've seen they use armatures to keep the person upright because the clay and the sort of thin armature that they've got underneath all of it is not quite enough to sort of support itself, so they still need bits to sort of hold it there. So I had sort of imagined that I would need something like that, but even with that, even if she's just floating in midair, like that, she's not getting out of that pose. Like there's weird problems, issues of tension. You can just about put her in certain poses, but like there's no way that I'm going to be able to fine tune it into an animation. Sorry, that was a bit of a weird pose I had her in. We'll just set her back down. So yeah, I don't know if elastic is the way really. I don't know how Moonjewel did it, but at the same time she was making dolls. She wasn't making maquettes for 3D animation, so she's not going to need as much precision as I will. So perhaps this is just not the right method to do this. So this video is going to pretty much end here, and then next video will probably be reworking the joints in a system that allows me to move them in a more fine-tuned way. I think it's probably going to be involving more socket joints, and the one that I'm thinking of is probably going to be more enclosed so you can't take the ball out, and then have grub screws or not grub screws because I think that wouldn't work with the ball, but a sort of some tightening ring of some kind, like a Jubilee clip that tightens the socket to the ball, and the friction is the thing that keeps it in place rather than elastic tension. Yeah, so I guess I'll see you then.